A hand closed around Elena Voss's wrist from behind the velvet curtain, and a voice she did not know whispered 4 words that stopped her heart. "Your family dies tonight." She turned so fast that her veil caught on the pin holding it in place, and a thin line of pain crossed her scalp. There was no one there, only the long hallway of the Moonstone Cathedral, lit by candles in iron holders, and the low hum of 500 wolves waiting on the other side of the doors for her to become their queen. Elena pressed her hand against the stone wall to steady herself. Her breath came fast and shallow. She looked down at her own fingers and saw they were shaking, the diamond on her left hand catching the candlelight and throwing small broken stars across the floor. A folded piece of paper lay at her feet. She had not noticed it before. She bent down, picked it up, and opened it with fingers that did not feel like her own. "Refuse him at the altar, or your mother and your sister will not see the sunrise. Do not speak of this. Do not warn anyone. We are watching every door." The paper trembled in her grip. Somewhere beyond the heavy doors, she could hear Damien Ashgrove's voice, low and warm, speaking to one of his generals, unaware that in a few short minutes his entire world was about to be taken from him in front of everyone he ruled. Elena had known Damien for 8 months. In that time she had watched a man everyone called cold and unreachable become something else entirely when he was near her. He remembered the smallest things she said. He had once ridden 4 hours through a storm because she mentioned she missed the taste of wild honey from her childhood home. 2 days later, a jar had appeared on her table, still warm from where it had been carried close to his skin to keep the cold from cracking the glass. She loved him. That was the truth, and it was also the reason the note now in her hand felt like a blade turned in her chest instead of simple paper. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway. Elena shoved the note into the folds of her gown, just as a young woman in a pale blue dress rounded the corner, smiling with the particular brightness of someone who has no idea what is coming. Charlotte, Elena's younger sister, clapped her hands together when she saw her. "You look like something out of an old painting," Charlotte said. "Everyone outside is already crying and the ceremony has not even started." Elena forced her mouth into a shape that resembled a smile. "Where is Mother?" she asked, and she heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "Sitting in the front row, refusing to let anyone fuss over her hair," Charlotte said, laughing. "She has been telling anyone who will listen that she always knew you would marry an Alpha King. Are you all right? You look pale." "I am only nervous," Elena said. It was not entirely a lie. Charlotte reached out and squeezed her hand, the same hand that moments before had been holding a piece of paper promising death. "Do not be nervous," Charlotte whispered. "He looks at you like you are the only person in the world. I have never seen him look at anyone that way. Not once." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they made the ground under Elena's feet feel unsteady, because she understood with a terrible clarity exactly what she was about to lose, and exactly what she could not risk losing instead. An older woman appeared behind Charlotte, her silver hair pinned high, her eyes bright with the particular pride of a mother who has raised a daughter through hardship and finally sees her safe. Grace Voss took one look at Elena's face and her smile faltered. "Something is wrong," Grace said quietly, stepping close enough that Charlotte could not hear. "Tell me." "Nothing is wrong," Elena said, and this time the lie cost her more than she thought it would. "I only need a moment alone before the doors open. Please, just a moment." Grace studied her daughter's face the way mothers do when they sense a storm behind calm words, but she nodded, took Charlotte gently by the arm, and led her back toward the cathedral doors, glancing over her shoulder once before she disappeared around the corner. Alone again, Elena pulled the note from her gown and read it a second time, as though the words might have changed, might have softened, might have revealed themselves to be some cruel joke instead of a promise carried on cold paper. They had not changed. "Refuse him at the altar, or your mother and your sister will not see the sunrise." She thought of running to find Damien immediately, of showing him the note and letting his strength stand between her family and whoever had written those words. But the note had said they were watching every door, and Alina had grown up hearing stories of what happened to people who tested threats like that one. She did not know who had written it. She did not know how many eyes were on her at that very moment. She only knew that the two people who mattered most to her in the world, aside from the man waiting behind those doors, were sitting in the front row of a cathedral full of strangers, and their lives had just been placed entirely in her hands. The doors opened. Light and sound rushed toward her, 500 voices falling silent at once, a wall of candlelight and expectant faces turning toward the entrance where she stood frozen. At the far end of the aisle, standing beneath an arch of white flowers, was Damien Ashgrove. He was taller than most men in the room, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime earning respect through strength rather than simply inheriting it. His dark hair was combed back from his face, and he wore black formal clothing with a single silver pin at his collar, the mark of his bloodline. But it was his eyes that Alina would remember for the rest of her life. Even from that distance, across the length of the cathedral, she could see the way they softened the moment they found her, the way his entire body seemed to settle, as though her presence alone had answered some question he had carried his whole life. Charlotte had been right. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world. Alina took one step forward, and then another, and with each step the note in her mind grew louder than the music playing around her. Refuse him, or they will not see the sunrise. She thought of her mother's silver hair, of Charlotte's bright laugh, of the honey jar still sitting on her table at home, still faintly sweet. Halfway down the aisle she stopped. A murmur rippled through the guests. Damien's brow creased slightly, confusion flickering across his composed features, though he did not move from his place beneath the flowers. Alina stood frozen between two impossible choices, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the entire room could hear it. She looked at him one last time, and in that look she tried to put everything she could not say. I love you. I am sorry. Please understand that I have no choice. Then she turned, gathered the heavy fabric of her gown in both hands, and ran. The gasp that rose from the guests sounded like a single collective breath torn from 500 throats at once. Alina did not look back. She could not. If she looked back and saw his face, she was certain she would lose whatever strength was carrying her legs forward, and her family would pay the price for her weakness. She burst through a side door meant for the cathedral staff, tore off her veil as she ran, and kept running, past startled attendants, past racks of extra chairs, until she reached a door leading out into the cold night air. She did not stop at the tree line. She did not stop when her shoes caught in the mud and she had to kick them off and continue barefoot. She ran until the sounds of the cathedral, the music, the gasps, the confused rising voices, faded into nothing behind her, replaced only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the wind moving through the trees. Behind her, inside the cathedral, chaos had broken loose. Guests rose from their seats, some calling out, some already moving toward the doors as though to chase after her. Charlotte stood frozen in the front row, her hand pressed to her mouth, disbelief written across every line of her young face. Grace gripped the back of the pew in front of her so tightly her knuckles turned white, searching the crowd for any explanation that made sense of what she had just seen. At the altar, Damien Ashgrove had not moved. He stood exactly where he had been standing when Alina turned and ran, his hands still loosely at his sides, his face carefully, terribly still. The murmurs around him grew louder, questions passed from guest to guest, whispers already beginning to shape themselves into a story that would spread across every pack in the region before the sun rose. The Alpha King, abandoned at his own altar, in front of his entire court. A tall man with graying hair at his temples stepped up beside Damien. This was Henry, his oldest advisor and closest friend, a man who had served Damien's father before him, and had never once seen the Alpha King humiliated in public. Henry's hand hovered near Damien's shoulder, uncertain whether to offer comfort or simply stand as a silent presence. "Send men after her," Henry said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only Damien could hear it over the rising noise of the crowd. "We can bring her back before anyone outside this room understands what has happened." Damien's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the storm moving beneath his controlled exterior. "No," he said, his voice flat and final. "Damien," Henry said, "this is not simply embarrassment. This is a message to every pack watching. If she is allowed to walk away from this without consequence, they will see it as weakness." "I said no," Damien repeated, louder this time, enough that several nearby guests fell silent to listen. "If she does not want to stand beside me, I will not force her to. I will not chase a woman through the woods like a beggar chasing scraps." He turned his gaze toward the open side door through which Alina had disappeared, and for one brief moment, something raw and unguarded crossed his face before the mask of the Alpha King settled back into place. "Let her go." The words carried through the cathedral, repeated from guest to guest until they reached the back rows, until they reached Grace and Charlotte, who stood clutching each other, utterly lost. Outside in the dark, Alina did not stop running until her legs simply refused to carry her any further. She collapsed against the trunk of an old oak tree at the edge of the forest, her bare feet cut and bleeding, her breath tearing in and out of her chest in painful gasps. Above her, the moon hung full and silver, indifferent to the wreckage she had just made of her own life. She pulled the crumpled note from where she had tucked it against her chest and read it one final time by the moon's cold light, as though rereading it might somehow undo the last hour, might carry her back to the moment before everything broke apart. It did not. The words remained exactly as cruel and exact as they had been the first time. "Refuse him, or your mother and your sister will not see the sunrise." She had refused him. She had done exactly as she was told, had humiliated the only man she had ever loved in front of everyone who mattered to him, had destroyed her own name and her own future in the space of a single terrible walk down an aisle. And she did not even know if it had been enough. She did not know who had written the note, what they truly wanted, or whether her mother and sister were safe at that very moment or already in danger despite everything she had sacrificed to protect them. Somewhere behind her, deep in the trees, a branch snapped. Alina's head snapped up, every muscle in her body going rigid with sudden fear. She was alone, barefoot, miles from anyone who could help her, in a gown that marked her as easy prey to anyone who might be watching. She had no pack protection now. The moment she turned and ran from that altar, she had given up every right to call on Damien's territory, his guards, his strength. She was, for the first time in her life, entirely on her own. A pair of eyes caught the moonlight between the trees, low to the ground, watching her without moving. Alina's breath caught in her throat. She pushed herself up from the ground, ignoring the pain in her feet, and began walking quickly away from the sound, deeper into unfamiliar woods, away from the cathedral, away from the man she had just betrayed to save the family she was no longer certain she had managed to protect at all. Behind her, the eyes in the darkness followed, patient and silent, and Alina understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her bones, that whatever she had run from that night, she had only just begun to run. The eyes in the darkness belonged to a lone wolf, not a man, and it did not follow her past the tree line where the forest gave way to a narrow dirt road. Alina did not know this until much later, when her heart had slowed enough to let her think clearly again. In that moment, all she knew was fear, and fear carried her 3 more miles down that road before her body finally gave out beneath her. She woke hours later in the back of a farmer's cart, covered by a rough wool blanket that smelled of hay and livestock. An old woman with kind eyes and calloused hands was watching her from the driver's seat, reins loose in her grip, the cart creaking along a road Alina did not recognize. "You fainted right in the middle of the road," the woman said, not unkindly. "Lucky I came along when I did, and not something with teeth. What is a girl in a wedding gown doing wandering barefoot in the dark, I wonder? Alina opened her mouth to answer and found she had no answer that made any sense. She settled instead for the truth, stripped of every detail that might identify her. I ran from something I could not stay for, she said. I have nowhere to go. The old woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though she had heard 100 stories like it before and had learned not to ask questions that did not need answering. There is a town 2 hours from here, she said. Small. No one asks too many questions if you do not give them reason to. You can ride with me that far. Alina spent that ride staring up at a sky slowly losing its stars to the coming dawn, and she thought of the note now soaked through and illegible in the pocket of her ruined gown. She thought of her mother's face, of Charlotte's laugh, and she wondered, with a fear that never fully left her in the years that followed, whether either of them was still safe, still breathing, still unaware of the reason the wedding had ended the way it had. She would not find out the answer to that question for 3 more days. The town the old woman brought her to was called Millhaven, a quiet place built along a river, far enough from any packed territory that most of its residents were ordinary people who had never seen a wolf shift in their life, and had no reason to suspect the barefoot woman in the market square had once been minutes away from becoming a queen. Alina traded her wedding gown to a seamstress for a plain dress, a pair of worn boots, and a handful of coins, enough to rent a small room above a bakery for a week. It was in that room, on the 3rd night, that a letter finally reached her, carried by a courier who had tracked her through 3 towns using nothing but rumor and a description of a barefoot woman in a torn gown. The letter was from Charlotte. Alina's hands shook so badly she nearly tore the paper trying to open it. She read it standing by the single window in her rented room, moonlight falling across the page, just as it had fallen across the note that had started everything 3 nights before. Mother and I are safe, Charlotte had written. We do not understand what happened and no one will tell us anything useful. The court is saying terrible things about you, Alina. They say you never loved him, that you used him to gain status and abandoned him the moment it suited you. I do not believe it, but I do not know what else to believe because you left without a word and now you are gone and I do not know where. Please, if you are safe, if you are alive, send word. I am begging you. Relief and grief arrived in Alina at the exact same moment, so tangled together that she could not separate one from the other. Her mother and sister were alive. Whatever the note had threatened, whoever had sent it, they had not yet carried out that threat, and for 1 night at least, Alina allowed herself to believe that her sacrifice had meant something. But she could not write back. Not yet. Not until she understood who had sent the note and whether replying, whether revealing any sign that she was in contact with her family, might put them in danger all over again. So she folded the letter carefully, tucked it beneath a loose floorboard in her rented room, and told herself it was only temporary, that soon she would understand enough to make things right. Soon became weeks, weeks became months. Alina took work where she could find it, first in the bakery below her room, kneading dough before dawn for a woman who asked no questions and paid little but paid on time. She learned to make bread with hands that had once worn silk gloves to formal court dinners. She learned to count coins carefully, to stretch a week's wages into 2, to disappear into a crowd so completely that no one looking at her would guess she had once stood at the edge of becoming the most powerful woman in the region. She thought of Damien every single day. She thought of the way his face had looked from halfway down the aisle. That brief flash of confusion before she turned and ran, and she wondered constantly whether he hated her now, whether he had already moved on, whether the warmth she remembered in his eyes had curdled entirely into contempt. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had done what she had to do, and that whatever he felt about her now was a smaller price than the alternative would have been. She was wrong about very little in her life, but she was wrong about that. 4 months after she fled Millhaven for a larger city further south, hoping to lose herself more completely in a place where no one would recognize even a rumor of her face, Alina found work as a seamstress's assistant in a shop that served wealthy families who had no idea their thread and buttons were being sorted by a woman once meant to rule an entire territory. It was steady work. It was safe work. For the first time since the wedding, Alina allowed herself to imagine a future that did not involve looking over her shoulder. That illusion lasted exactly 6 weeks. She was walking home from the shop one evening, a basket of mending balanced against her hip, when a man fell into step beside her on the empty street. He was tall, dressed plainly enough to pass unnoticed in a crowd, but there was something in the way he moved, controlled and deliberate, that made every instinct in Alina's body go cold with recognition even before he spoke. "You did well," the man said quietly, not looking at her, his eyes fixed straight ahead as though they were simply two strangers walking the same direction, refusing him at the altar. "Very well indeed, but I am afraid the arrangement was never truly finished." Alina stopped walking. The man did not stop with her, continuing several more steps before he finally turned back, an unhurried smile on a face she would never forget for as long as she lived. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver threaded through dark hair and eyes the pale gray of a winter sky. "Who are you?" Alina demanded, her voice lower than she intended, fear making it come out rougher than she meant. "What do you want from me now? I did exactly what the note said. My family is safe. What more could you possibly want?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a merchant studies goods before deciding on a price. "My name is Nathaniel," he said, as though the introduction cost him nothing at all. "And what I want, Alina, is quite simple. I want to make sure you never go back to him. Not now. Not in 5 years. Not ever. Because as long as Damien Ashgrove believes you betrayed him without reason, he will never look for you, and as long as he never looks for you, certain matters that concern me remain settled and quiet. You understand?" "I do not understand anything," Alina said, though a cold dread was already beginning to spread through her chest as pieces began arranging themselves into a shape she did not want to see. Nathaniel smiled again, and this time there was nothing warm in it at all. "You will," he said. "In time you will understand exactly how deep this goes and exactly how little choice you had from the very beginning. For now, simply remember this. Your family remains safe only as long as you remain gone. Should you ever attempt to return to him, to explain yourself, to seek his protection again, the arrangement changes. Do we understand each other?" Alina could not speak. She could only nod, her basket of mending forgotten at her feet, her entire body trembling with a fear that went far beyond the simple threat of violence. This man, whoever he truly was, had known exactly where to find her, had tracked her across 4 months and 2 cities without her ever sensing she was being watched. If he could find her that easily, he could find her mother. He could find Charlotte. He could find anyone. "Good," Nathaniel said, as though her silence were answer enough. "Then I believe we have an understanding. Enjoy your quiet life, Alina. It suits you." He walked away into the gathering dark, leaving her standing alone on the empty street with her basket of mending scattered at her feet, and a fear settling into her bones that would not fully leave her for the next 5 years. She understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water poured over her heart, that whatever had truly happened the night of her wedding, whatever forces had moved behind the note that changed the entire course of her life, it was far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And she was, whether she wished it or not, now trapped inside it, with no way back to the life she had left behind, and no way forward that did not carry the constant weight of watching every shadow, every stranger, every unfamiliar face on every street she walked for the rest of her days. She gathered her scattered mending with shaking hands, and that night, for the first time since fleeing the cathedral, she allowed herself to cry, not for the wedding she had abandoned, not even for the man she had humiliated in front of his entire court, but for the simple, aching understanding that whatever life she had once imagined for herself was now permanently, irreversibly gone, replaced by something far darker that she had never asked for and could not yet see the end of. 5 years passed slowly when every single day is spent looking over one shoulder for a face that might belong to Nathaniel or one of his men. Alina learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, moving from city to city, whenever she felt eyes lingering too long on her face, changing her name twice, cutting her hair short, and letting it grow long again. Anything that might blur the memory of the woman who had once stood at the edge of a wedding altar in a gown worth more than most people earned in a year. By the 3rd year, the woman who had been a seamstress's assistant, a bakery worker, a stranger passing through a dozen small towns, had become someone Alina barely recognized when she caught her own reflection in shop windows. Her hands, once soft, were rough now from years of physical work. Her clothes were practical and worn, mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. She had learned to eat little and complain less, to sleep with one eye open in rented rooms that locked poorly, to trust almost no one, because trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had also, despite every precaution, lost nearly everything Nathaniel's threat had been meant to protect. The letter came in her 4th year of running, delivered to a small apartment in a city so far from Millhaven that Alina had genuinely believed, for the first time, that she might finally be safe. It was from Charlotte again, the handwriting shakier than Alina remembered, the ink smudged in places as though tears had fallen onto the page before it dried. "Mother is gone," Charlotte had written. "She grew ill in the winter and never recovered, and I could not find you to tell you before she passed. I do not know if you will ever read this. I do not know if you are even alive. But I need you to know that in her final days, she asked for you constantly. She never stopped believing you had a reason for what you did that day, even when the rest of the world called you nothing but a coward and a betrayer. I am alone now, Alina. Our family's protection, whatever arrangement kept us safe after you disappeared, seems to have fallen apart along with everything else. I do not know how much longer I can manage on my own. Please, if there is any part of you still out there, come home." Alina read that letter perhaps 100 times over the following weeks, until the paper grew soft and thin from handling, until the words blurred not from age but from the tears that fell onto them each time she unfolded it. Her mother was gone. She had run, had sacrificed everything, had spent 4 years in hiding and fear, and in the end it had not even mattered. Her mother had died anyway, believing in a daughter she could no longer see, and Alina had not even been there to hold her hand at the end. Grief carved something out of Alina that never fully grew back. She stopped moving cities so frequently after that. Part of it was practical, the exhaustion of constant flight finally catching up to her after years of never staying anywhere long enough to build even the thinnest thread of stability. But part of it was something closer to surrender, a quiet giving up on the idea that safety was something she could ever truly find, no matter how far she ran or how completely she erased herself. She settled, if it could be called settling, in a port city where work was plentiful for anyone willing to do it without asking questions, and questions were rarely asked of anyone in return. She worked the docks when no other work could be found, hauling crates alongside men twice her size, earning barely enough to keep a roof over her head and food in her stomach. She was no longer the woman who had once been fitted for a queen's gown. She had become something harder, thinner, more tired, a woman whose eyes had learned to watch every doorway and every stranger's hands. Charlotte's letters grew less frequent as the years went on, not because her sister's love had faded, but because Charlotte herself had begun struggling simply to survive without the resources their family once had. The last letter Alina received, arriving just after the start of her 5th year away, contained no news of comfort at all. "I have found work, but it is not enough," Charlotte wrote. "I am afraid, Alina. There are men asking questions about our family again, the same kind of men Mother always warned us to avoid speaking to. I do not know what they want, but I do not think it is anything good. I do not know where you are or if you will ever read this in time, but if you can, if there is any way at all, I need you to come home. I cannot do this alone any longer." Alina sat with that letter clutched in both hands for hours, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a rented room above a dockside tavern, the sound of rough laughter and clinking glasses drifting up through the floorboards. 5 years had passed since she ran from that altar. 5 years of hiding, of grief, of watching her own family fall apart despite every sacrifice she had made to protect them. And still, somehow, the danger had followed them anyway, patient and inevitable, exactly as Nathaniel had promised it would if she ever tried to return. But what choice did she have left? Her mother was gone. Her sister was alone, frightened, and asking for the one thing Alina had spent 5 years denying her, denying herself. And Alina understood, sitting alone in that rented room with the sound of the docks rumbling faintly through the walls, that whatever fear Nathaniel had planted in her all those years ago, whatever threat still hung over her head, she could not continue running while the last person she loved in the world faced danger alone. She thought of Damien for the first time in months, allowing herself the luxury of the memory instead of pushing it away the moment it surfaced, as she had trained herself to do for years. She wondered if he still ruled his territory with the same quiet strength she remembered. She wondered if he had married someone else in the years since, someone who had not run from him at the altar, someone who could give him the partnership and loyalty Alina had once promised, and then shattered in front of everyone who mattered. She wondered if he would even remember her as anything other than the woman who had humiliated him in front of his entire court, or if 5 years and whatever rumors had spread in her absence had erased any warmth he once felt entirely, replacing it with nothing but cold contempt. It did not matter. Charlotte needed help that Alina alone could no longer provide. Whatever pride Alina still carried, whatever fear still lived in her chest at the thought of facing Nathaniel's promised consequences, none of it mattered more than her sister's safety. That night, for the first time in 5 years, Alina began making plans that did not involve running further away, but instead involved turning back toward the one place she had spent half a decade convincing herself she could never return to. She sold what little she owned that held any value at all, a small collection of jewelry she had kept hidden and unworn since fleeing Millhaven, pieces too plain to draw attention but valuable enough to fund a journey. She packed a single bag with the practical clothes that had become her only wardrobe, and she left the port city before dawn on a morning cold enough that her breath fogged in front of her face with every step. The journey back toward Damien's territory took nearly 3 weeks, traveling by whatever transport she could afford, sleeping in inns when she had the coin, and in the open when she did not. Every mile closer to his lands brought with it a fresh wave of fear, not only of Nathaniel and whatever consequences he had promised, but of facing Damien himself, of standing before the man she had betrayed and asking for the one thing she had no right to ask for anymore. She thought often during that long journey of what she would say to him, how she could possibly explain 5 years of silence, a mother's death, a sister's fear, and a threat she had never been able to name or fight against alone. She rehearsed the words 100 times, discarded them, rehearsed new ones, discarded those as well, until by the time the first watchtowers of Damien's territory came into view on the horizon, she had no speech left prepared at all, only the raw, unpolished truth and whatever mercy he might or might not choose to offer her. She arrived at the border of his lands on a gray afternoon, thinner than she had ever been in her life, her clothes worn and travel-stained, her once carefully kept hands rough and scarred from years of labor she never could have imagined for herself on the morning of her wedding. The guards at the checkpoint did not recognize her at first, and why would they, looking at the ruined, exhausted woman standing before them instead of the radiant bride who had once stood at the edge of an altar 5 years before? It was only when she gave her name, quietly, steadily, despite the way her voice shook on the single word, that everything around her seemed to stop. "Alina," she said, "Alina Voss, I am here to see Alpha King Damien Ashgrove." The name moved through the checkpoint faster than Alina could have anticipated. One guard went pale and immediately signaled to another, who disappeared through a gate at a near run, leaving Alina standing alone with the remaining guards, their eyes fixed on her with an expression somewhere between disbelief and open hostility. "You cannot be serious," one of them finally said, a younger man who looked barely old enough to have been a guard 5 years earlier, though clearly old enough to have heard the story told and retold in the years since. "Alina Voss, the woman who left the Alpha King standing at the altar in front of the entire court, and you simply walk up to our border and give your name as though nothing happened." "I am not asking for a welcome," Alina said quietly, forcing herself to meet his eyes despite the shame burning in her chest. "I am asking to speak with him. That is all." The older guard who had run off returned several minutes later, accompanied by a tall man with graying hair Alina recognized instantly, even after 5 years. Henry had aged since the last time she had seen him, deep lines now etched into a face that had once been merely stern, but his eyes, when they landed on her, held the same sharp intelligence she remembered, along with something new, a wariness that had not been there before. "Well," Henry said slowly, studying her from head to foot with an expression that gave away nothing of what he was thinking, "I did not expect to see this day. You look nothing like the woman who disappeared from that cathedral 5 years ago." "5 years does that to a person," Alina said, and she heard the exhaustion bleeding into her own voice, could not hide it even if she wanted to. "Please, Henry, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I need to speak with him. It is not for myself. My sister is in danger and I do not know where else to turn." Henry's expression did not soften, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a careful, considering stillness that suggested he was weighing her words against 5 years of carefully constructed anger on his Alpha King's behalf. "He does not know you are here yet," Henry said finally. "I will not pretend that telling him will be simple. He has spent 5 years building a wall around whatever he felt for you, Alina, and I do not know what will happen when that wall is tested. But I also remember what you were like before that day, and I find it difficult to believe you would return here, looking as you do, without a reason serious enough to risk everything you must know awaits you." "Thank you," Alina whispered, relief and terror tangled so tightly together in her chest that she could barely tell which emotion was stronger. "Do not thank me yet," Henry said. "Come. But understand, Alina, that whatever happens in the next hour is entirely out of my hands, and very likely entirely out of yours as well." She was led through the gates of the territory she had once been meant to rule, past guards who stared openly, past servants who stopped their work entirely to watch her pass, whispers following her like a current through every hallway and courtyard. The castle itself had changed little in 5 years, the same gray stone walls, the same tall windows catching the afternoon light, but Alina felt like a ghost moving through it, disconnected from the version of herself who had once walked these same halls with hope instead of dread. Henry led her not to Damien's private chambers, but to the great hall where the court gathered for formal matters, and Alina understood immediately what that choice meant. She was not being welcomed back quietly. She was being brought forward as a matter for the entire court to witness, just as her departure had been witnessed by all of them 5 years before. The hall was already filling by the time they arrived, word of her return spreading through the castle faster than Henry could have possibly outpaced it. Alina stood near the center of the vast room, feeling every eye in the growing crowd fix on her, feeling the weight of 5 years of rumor and judgment pressing down on her all at once. She recognized some faces from her wedding day, older now, staring at her with expressions ranging from open hostility to something closer to curious pity. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Damien Ashgrove walked in. Alina's breath caught in her throat so completely she thought for a moment she might not be able to draw another one. 5 years had changed him too, though in different ways than they had changed her. He was broader now, harder somehow, his face carrying new lines that had not been there before, lines that Alina understood, with a painful twist in her chest, she was at least partially responsible for. His dark eyes swept across the hall and found her almost instantly, and for one brief, unguarded moment, something flickered across his expression: shock, disbelief. Something that might have once been hope before it hardened into something far colder. The hall fell utterly silent as he crossed the distance toward her, each footstep measured and deliberate, the crowd parting before him without needing to be told. He stopped several feet away, close enough that Alina could see every detail of the man he had become in her absence, far enough that the space between them felt like a canyon neither of them knew how to cross. "Alina," Damien said, and his voice, when it finally came, was flat and controlled in a way that frightened her far more than anger would have. "I confess I did not expect to hear that name again. Certainly not spoken at my own gates." "I know I have no right to be here," Alina said, forcing the words out despite how badly her voice shook. "I know what I did to you. I have thought about it every single day for 5 years, and I do not expect forgiveness, and I am not asking for it now. But I need your help, Damien, not for myself, for my sister." A murmur rippled through the watching court, and Damien's expression tightened further, the mask of calm control never fully slipping, but something dangerous simmering just beneath its surface. "You vanished for 5 years," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall despite its quiet, controlled tone. "You leave me standing at an altar in front of every pack leader in this region, humiliated, made a mockery of by the woman I trusted more than anyone alive. And now, after 5 years of silence, you appear at my gates asking for my help, as though nothing at all happened between us." "I never wanted to hurt you," Alina said, and despite every rehearsed speech she had discarded on the long journey here, the words that came now were raw and unpracticed, torn straight from wherever the truth had been buried for 5 long years. "I loved you. I still love you if that means anything to you at all after everything. But that day, someone threatened my family, told me that if I did not refuse you, they would not survive the night. I did not have time to explain. I did not have anyone I could trust to help me, and I made a choice that I have paid for every single day since. My mother is dead, Damien. She died believing I abandoned my own family along with you, and I was too afraid to even go to her, because I believed doing so would put my sister in danger. And now my sister is alone and frightened and asking for help I cannot give her by myself. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to help someone who has done nothing wrong, because I have nowhere else in this world left to turn." Silence stretched through the hall so complete that Alina could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Damien's face had gone very still, the careful mask cracking just slightly at the edges, revealing something raw and complicated underneath that he clearly had not expected to feel again after 5 years of building walls specifically designed to keep this exact moment from ever touching him. Henry stepped forward slightly, breaking the tension just enough to let both of them breathe. "My lord," he said carefully, "perhaps this is a conversation better held in private rather than in front of the full court." Damien did not look away from Alina, his dark eyes fixed on her face as though searching for some sign of the lie he clearly still expected to find beneath her words. "No," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced any further suggestion of privacy. "If she wishes to make her case before me, she can make it before everyone who witnessed her leave me. She owes this court that much, at the very least." Alina swallowed hard, understanding exactly what he was doing, understanding that whatever mercy might still exist somewhere beneath 5 years of hardened anger, he was not going to grant it easily, and he was not going to grant it without first making her stand exposed and vulnerable in front of the very people who had watched her humiliate him. It was, she realized, a kind of fair trade, though it did not feel remotely fair standing in the center of it. "Then let me tell you everything," she said, lifting her chin despite the exhaustion and fear threatening to buckle her knees beneath her. "Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, and let this court decide for themselves whether I deserve whatever judgment follows." Damien studied her for a long, unreadable moment, the entire hall holding its breath around them, before he finally gave a single, sharp nod. "Then speak," he said. "And you had better hope, Alina Voss, that whatever truth you carry is enough to explain 5 years of silence, because I have very little patience left for anything less." Alina took a breath and began, her voice trembling at first before steadying as the words she had carried in silence for 5 years finally found their way into open air. She told the court about the hand that had grabbed her wrist behind the cathedral curtain, about the note left at her feet, about the threat against her mother and her sister, spoken in words so cold and certain she had never once doubted they were real. She told them about running, not toward safety, but into 5 years of constant fear, moving from city to city, changing her name, cutting ties with anyone who might have recognized her, all in service of a threat she had never been able to identify or fight. She told them about the man named Nathaniel who had found her 4 months after she fled, who had confirmed that the danger was real and ongoing, who had made it clear that any attempt to return, to explain herself, to seek help from Damien again, would place her family in even greater danger than before. She told them about her mother's death, about the letter that had reached her too late to say goodbye, about Charlotte's growing fear as whatever protection had once kept their family safe seemed to unravel piece by piece in Alina's absence. And finally, she told them about the most recent letter, the one that had finally broken through 5 years of careful hiding and brought her back to a place she had believed she could never return to. Throughout her account, the great hall remained utterly silent, 500 faces watching her with expressions that shifted slowly from open hostility to something more complicated, doubt mixing with reluctant sympathy, judgment softening into uncertainty. Damien himself stood perfectly still through the entire telling, his face carefully composed, though Alina could see, even from several feet away, the way his jaw tightened at certain details, the way his hands curled slightly at his sides when she spoke of her mother's death. When she finally finished, silence hung over the hall for a long, suspended moment before Henry stepped forward again, his own expression troubled. "This man, Nathaniel," Henry said slowly, "did he ever explain why your marriage specifically threatened whatever arrangement he was protecting? Why would a union between you and Alpha King Ashgrove matter enough to threaten murder over it?" "I do not know," Alina admitted. "He never explained his reasons. He only made clear that as long as Damien believed I had betrayed him without cause, certain matters remained settled and quiet, as he put it. I have spent 5 years trying to understand what that meant, and I have never found an answer." A new voice rose from among the gathered court, an older woman with sharp eyes who Alina vaguely recognized as one of the pack elders who had blessed her in Damien's engagement 5 years earlier. "This sounds convenient," the woman said, her tone skeptical. "A mysterious stranger, a threat no one else witnessed, a note that conveniently no longer exists as proof. Forgive me, but this story asks us to simply take your word for events that ruined our Alpha King's reputation in front of every allied territory in the region." "I understand your doubt," Alina said, meeting the woman's skeptical gaze without flinching, though it cost her considerable effort to do so. "I have no proof beyond my own word, because Nathaniel made certain of that from the very beginning. But I did not come here today for anyone's belief. I came because my sister needs protection I cannot provide alone, and whatever any of you think of me, she has done nothing to deserve suffering for choices that were entirely mine." Damien finally spoke, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun rising among the crowd. "Enough," he said, and the hall fell silent instantly at the command in his tone. "Whatever the truth of this story, one thing is beyond dispute. A woman claims her family is in danger. Whether or not I choose to forgive what happened 5 years ago, I will not turn away someone who came here asking for protection for an innocent person. Henry, see that Charlotte Voss is located and brought under our protection immediately, wherever she may currently be." Relief crashed through Alina so suddenly that her knees genuinely did buckle this time, and she had to catch herself against a nearby pillar to keep from sinking to the floor entirely. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. "Do not thank me yet," Damien said, echoing Henry's earlier words with a coldness that made clear the gratitude was premature. "I'm extending protection to your sister because she has done nothing to warrant otherwise. That is not the same as forgiveness, Alina. That is not the same as trust. You destroyed something 5 years ago that I do not know can ever be fully rebuilt, and I will not pretend otherwise simply because you have arrived with a sympathetic story and a sister in need of rescue." "I understand," Alina said quietly, and she did understand, more completely than perhaps anyone else in that hall could have known. She had not come expecting forgiveness. She had come because there was nowhere else left to turn, and whatever cold reception awaited her here was still infinitely better than watching her sister face danger entirely alone. "You will remain within these walls," Damien continued, his tone shifting into something more formal, more like a ruler issuing decree than a man speaking to someone he had once loved. "Not as my intended bride, not as a guest of honor. You will remain under guard, both for your own protection and to ensure this Nathaniel, whoever he truly is, does not follow you here and cause further harm to anyone within my territory. You will answer any questions my advisors have regarding this threat, and you will assist in identifying exactly who is behind it. Beyond that, I make no promises regarding what comes next." "That is more than I hoped for when I arrived at your gates," Alina said honestly. "Thank you, Damien, truly." He studied her for one final, long moment, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes before he turned away entirely, addressing Henry instead of her. "See that she is given quarters in the East Wing," he said, "away from the main halls, and post guards, not merely for protection, but to ensure she does not leave these grounds without my knowledge." "You believe I would run again," Alina said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice despite understanding exactly why he would think it. Damien paused, his back still turned toward her, his shoulders tense beneath the formal fabric of his coat. "I do not know what to believe about you anymore, Alina," he said quietly, quiet enough that only she and Henry standing nearby could hear it clearly. "That is precisely the problem." He walked from the hall without looking back, and the crowd of watching wolves slowly began to disperse around Alina, whispers rising once again, though quieter now, more uncertain than they had been before she spoke. Henry remained beside her, watching the doors through which Damien had disappeared with an expression Alina could not quite read. "He has not looked that unsettled in 5 years," Henry said finally, almost to himself. "Whatever else is true, Alina, you have clearly disturbed something in him that he worked very hard to bury." "Is that a good thing or a terrible one?" Alina asked, exhaustion finally catching up with her entirely now that the immediate danger of the confrontation had passed. Henry considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I suppose," he said, "that depends entirely on what the two of you do next." He led her from the great hall, through quieter corridors toward the East Wing, and Alina walked beside him in silence, her mind still replaying every word of the confrontation, every flicker of emotion she had glimpsed behind Damien's carefully controlled mask. She did not know what waited for her in the coming days, whether Charlotte would be found safely, whether Nathaniel would strike again now that she had broken 5 years of careful silence, or whether whatever remained of Damien's feelings for her could ever grow into something resembling trust again. But for the first time in 5 years, she was no longer running. She was no longer alone in carrying the weight of a threat she could not fight by herself. Whatever came next, she would face it inside these walls, under whatever protection Damien had grudgingly extended, and that, after 5 years of exhausted, isolated fear, felt like the first true breath of relief she had allowed herself since the night she fled her own wedding. Charlotte arrived at the castle gates 6 days later, escorted by a pair of Damien's most trusted guards, thinner than Alina remembered and visibly exhausted from a journey made in haste and fear, but alive, and safe, and utterly overwhelmed the moment she saw her sister waiting in the courtyard. The two women held each other for a long time, neither speaking, both simply relieved beyond words to finally be in the same place again after 5 years of separation and uncertainty. When Charlotte finally pulled back enough to look at Alina properly, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You look so different," Charlotte said softly, "older, tired. I almost did not recognize you when they told me who had sent for me." "5 years will do that," Alina said, echoing the same words she had spoken to Henry days before, though this time they carried none of the exhaustion and all of the relief. "I am just glad you are safe. That is all that matters right now." Charlotte was given quarters near Alina's own, and over the following days, as she slowly recovered from the fear and uncertainty of her final months alone, she filled in details Alina had never known. She described men who had come asking questions about their family's finances, about old debts their father had supposedly left behind, about connections to territories neither sister had ever heard mentioned before. She described feeling watched constantly in the months before Alina's letter finally reached her requesting she come to Damien's territory. The same creeping dread Alina herself had lived with for 5 long years, finally passed down to the one person she had sacrificed everything trying to protect. Henry took careful notes during Charlotte's account, cross-referencing every detail against whatever information his own investigators had managed to gather in the days since Alina's return. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture began forming, one that suggested Nathaniel was not acting entirely alone, that whatever arrangement he had threatened Alina to protect involved connections reaching further and deeper than a single man's personal grievance. Damien remained distant throughout this process, present at every formal meeting where information was gathered and discussed, but carefully, deliberately maintaining distance from Alina herself whenever the meetings ended. He spoke to her only when necessary, addressed her with the same cold formality he might use with any stranger seeking his territory's protection, and Alina told herself repeatedly that this was exactly what she deserved, exactly what she had expected when she first walked back through his gates. It did not make the distance hurt any less. 2 weeks into her return, Alina was called to a private meeting with Damien and Henry regarding new information the investigators had uncovered. A meeting held not in the Great Hall this time, but in a smaller study lined with old books and maps of the surrounding territories. Damien sat behind a heavy wooden desk, Henry standing beside him, both men's expressions grave as Alina entered and took the chair offered across from them. "We have identified who Nathaniel truly is," Henry began without preamble. "His full name is Nathaniel Ashford, and until 3 years ago, he served as an advisor to a neighboring pack whose territory borders yours to the east, Damien. That pack's leader passed away under circumstances that were never fully investigated, and Nathaniel has since gained considerable influence over the pack's current, much younger leadership." "What does any of that have to do with my wedding?" Alina asked, confusion tightening her voice. Damien answered this time, his eyes fixed on a map spread across the desk rather than on Alina directly, as though looking at her while discussing this remained too difficult to manage. "Our marriage would have united two of the strongest territories in this region," he said. "A union that strong would have shifted the balance of power significantly, making it far more difficult for smaller, ambitious territories like the one Nathaniel now effectively controls to expand their own influence without facing serious resistance. Preventing that marriage, it seems, was never about you specifically, Alina. It was about keeping this region fractured enough for Nathaniel and whoever he answers to continue growing their own power unchecked." The weight of that realization settled over Alina slowly, painfully, as she began to understand the full scope of what her sacrifice had actually been protecting against, and how little her own personal happiness, her own reputation, her own 5 years of suffering had ever truly mattered to the people orchestrating her downfall. "I destroyed everything," she said quietly, more to herself than to either man in the room. I destroyed everything, and it was never even about me at all. It was about you, Damien said, his voice quieter now, some of the cold formality slipping just slightly. You were simply the easiest piece to move in order to achieve what they actually wanted. Henry cleared his throat gently, breaking the tension that had begun building between them. The more pressing matter, he said, is that if our information is correct, Nathaniel is unlikely to simply allow this situation to resolve peacefully now that Alina has returned and revealed what she knows. A fractured alliance was valuable to him. A reconciled one, should that be where this ultimately leads, represents exactly the outcome he spent 5 years working to prevent. You believe he will act against us directly? Damien asked, his attention sharpening immediately. I believe, Henry said carefully, that we should prepare for exactly that possibility. Alina's return has already disturbed whatever careful balance Nathaniel constructed. He will not simply allow that disturbance to continue without consequence. Alina felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her, though it was different now than the fear that had driven her into hiding 5 years earlier. This fear was not for herself alone, but for Charlotte, for the castle full of people around her, for Damien himself, all of whom now stood exposed to danger because of choices set in motion long before any of them had understood what was truly happening. Then we prepare, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. Whatever Nathaniel intends, I will not run from it again. I spent 5 years running and it protected no one in the end. My mother is still dead. My sister still suffered. Running has never once solved anything. If he intends to act, then I would rather face it directly than spend another 5 years looking over my shoulder waiting for a blow that never stops threatening to fall. Damien looked at her then, truly looked at her, for the first time since she had returned, something shifting behind his carefully guarded expression, an old familiar flicker of respect that Alina recognized from months before her wedding, when he had first begun to trust her judgment in matters far beyond simple courtship. That is the first thing you have said since returning, he said quietly. That sounds like the woman I once believed I knew. Alina held his gaze, unwilling to look away despite the vulnerability the moment demanded. I am still her, she said. I never stopped being her, Damien. I only became someone forced to hide her for 5 years, out of fear I could not fight alone. But I am done hiding now. Whatever comes next, whatever Nathaniel intends, I would rather face it standing beside people I trust than running from it entirely alone again. The study fell silent for a long moment, Henry glancing carefully between the two of them, clearly aware he was witnessing something delicate shifting in the space between his alpha king and the woman who had once shattered his heart in front of an entire court. Finally, Damien nodded, slowly, deliberately, and turned his attention back to the map spread across his desk. Then we prepare together, he said, and though his voice remained carefully controlled, Alina heard something new beneath it, something that had not been present in any of their conversations since her return. Not quite forgiveness, not quite trust restored, but something, perhaps, that might eventually grow into either, given enough time and enough proof that the woman standing before him now was exactly who she claimed to be. Preparation took the shape of long days spent in strategy meetings. Guards doubled at every gate and border checkpoint. Scouts sent quietly into neighboring territories to gather whatever information they could about Nathaniel's movements and intentions. Alina, rather than being kept apart from these efforts as she had expected, found herself increasingly included. Her knowledge of Nathaniel's appearance, his mannerisms, the particular way he spoke, proving valuable in ways none of them had initially anticipated. She spent hours with Henry, describing every detail she could remember from her single encounter with Nathaniel 5 years earlier, watching as his investigators cross-referenced her descriptions against known associates of the neighboring territory's leadership. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge, not just of Nathaniel himself, but of the network of influence he had spent years quietly building, using fear and manipulation rather than open conflict to reshape the balance of power across the region. Damien remained present for most of these sessions, though he said little, watching Alina work with an expression that had grown gradually less guarded over the passing days, even as he maintained careful distance in every other aspect of their interactions. Alina noticed the shift, though she said nothing of it, unwilling to risk pushing him faster than he was ready to move, understanding on some deep level that trust rebuilt in haste rarely survived any real test. It was Charlotte, surprisingly, who first broached the subject directly, finding Alina alone in the castle gardens one evening as the sun began setting behind the western towers, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet. "He watches you," Charlotte said without preamble, settling onto the stone bench beside her sister, "when you are not looking. I have noticed it several times now." Alina kept her eyes fixed on the darkening sky, unwilling to let the small flare of hope in her chest show too plainly on her face. "He is simply cautious," she said. "He has every reason to watch me carefully, given everything that happened." "That is not the kind of watching I mean," Charlotte said, a small, knowing smile touching her lips despite the exhaustion still lingering in her own eyes from months of fear and uncertainty. "I saw the way he looked at you 5 years ago, Alina, right before you ran. And I have seen glimpses of that same look these past weeks, buried underneath all his careful coldness, but still there. I do not think 5 years erased what he felt for you. I think he has simply been afraid to trust it again." "I destroyed his trust in front of his entire court," Alina said quietly. "I do not know if that kind of damage can ever truly be undone, no matter what either of us might still feel underneath it." Charlotte reached over and took her sister's hand, squeezing it gently, the same gesture of comfort Alina remembered from years before every hallway had led toward wedding vows and betrayal instead of simple sisterly affection. "Trust can be rebuilt," Charlotte said softly. "It takes time and it takes proof, but it is not impossible. You came back for me, Alina, at enormous risk to yourself, when you could have kept running and kept yourself safe instead. That is proof of exactly the kind of person you truly are. Perhaps it is simply a matter of giving him enough time to see it clearly himself." Alina said nothing, but she held on to her sister's words in the days that followed, carrying them like a small, fragile hope through the growing tension that settled over the castle as reports from the scouts began arriving with increasingly troubling news. Nathaniel had been seen moving openly near the eastern border, accompanied by a larger force than any of them had anticipated, gathering allies from smaller territories that had long resented the influence Damien's strength held over the region. The threat, once distant and theoretical, was rapidly becoming immediate and undeniable. 10 days after Charlotte's arrival, Henry called an urgent meeting in the Great Hall, gathering not only Damien's closest advisors but every senior guard and scout available within the territory. Alina stood near the back of the assembled group, uncertain of her place among military strategy she had no real experience with, until Damien's eyes found her across the crowded room and he gestured once toward the front. "Come forward, Alina," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "You know this man better than anyone else here. Your insight may prove valuable in understanding what he intends." She moved through the crowd, aware of the eyes following her, some still openly skeptical, others now watching with something closer to grudging respect after weeks of witnessing her genuine effort to help identify and understand the threat facing them all. She took a place near the front, close enough to Damien that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the careful distance he still maintained between them physically. "Our scouts confirm Nathaniel has gathered a force of roughly 200 fighters, drawn from at least 3 smaller territories along our eastern border," Henry said, spreading a detailed map across the central table for everyone to examine. "Their movements suggest they intend to strike within the week, likely targeting our eastern checkpoints first, testing our defenses before committing to a larger assault." "Why now?" one of the senior guards asked. If this man has spent years working quietly to fracture our alliances, why risk open conflict at all? Because Alina's return threatens everything he built, Damien answered before Henry could respond, his eyes flicking briefly toward Alina before returning to the map. If she remains here, if the truth of what happened 5 years ago becomes fully known and accepted, the alliance he spent years preventing becomes possible again. He cannot allow that. Open conflict, however risky, is preferable to him than allowing that alliance to reform peacefully. Alina felt the weight of that statement settle heavily across her shoulders. Once again, however unintentionally, her presence had become the catalyst for danger threatening an entire territory full of people who had done nothing to deserve it. But this time, unlike 5 years before, she was not going to run from the consequences of that danger. She was going to stand and fight it directly, alongside people she was slowly, carefully beginning to trust again. If he intends to strike within the week, Alina said, her voice steady despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest, then perhaps our best strategy is not to wait for him to choose the timing and location of that first confrontation. What if instead, we made clear that we are prepared, that we know his plans, and that any attack will be met with far greater resistance than he currently anticipates? Men like Nathaniel rely on fear and secrecy to succeed. Strip away that secrecy, and perhaps his allies reconsider whether the risk is truly worth the reward he has promised them. Silence settled over the hall as the assembled advisors considered her words, several exchanging glances that suggested the strategy held genuine merit despite its unconventional source. Damien studied Alina for a long moment, something thoughtful and increasingly less guarded moving behind his dark eyes. "She is right," he said finally, and Alina felt a small, unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the simple acknowledgement. Fear has been Nathaniel's greatest weapon from the very beginning. If we remove that advantage, force him into open confrontation on terms he has not fully chosen himself, we may yet turn this entire situation in our favor. The meeting continued for hours after that, detailed strategies forming and reforming as new information arrived. But Alina found herself increasingly aware, throughout the long night of planning, of the subtle shift that had occurred in how Damien looked at her, spoke to her, considered her contributions alongside his most trusted advisors. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and certainly not the easy warmth they had once shared before everything shattered apart. But it was something, a crack of light beginning to show through 5 years of carefully constructed walls, and Alina allowed herself, for the first time since returning through his gates, to hope that whatever came next in the coming confrontation with Nathaniel, it might carry with it the possibility of rebuilding something she had once believed was lost to her forever. 3 days after the strategy meeting, a messenger arrived at the castle gates carrying a formal challenge from Nathaniel himself, delivered with the kind of arrogant confidence that suggested he had never once considered the possibility of defeat. The message, read aloud by Henry in front of the assembled court, demanded that Alina be surrendered to face judgment for crimes against the stability of the region, and warned that any refusal would be met with immediate and overwhelming force against Damien's territory. The great hall erupted into furious murmurs the moment Henry finished reading, several senior guards immediately voicing outrage at the sheer audacity of the demand. Alina stood near the front of the gathered crowd, her stomach twisting with a fear she recognized immediately, the same fear that had once driven her to abandon everything she loved rather than risk the people she cared about. "I will not allow this," Damien said, his voice cutting through the noise with an authority that silenced the hall instantly. He crumpled the message in one fist, his expression carrying a controlled fury Alina had never witnessed from him before, even in the earliest days of her return when his anger toward her had been at its rawest. "Nathaniel has no authority within these lands to demand anything of anyone standing within them. This is nothing more than an attempt to provoke exactly the kind of hasty, fearful decision that has served his interests for years. He will attack regardless of our answer, Henry said grimly, studying the crumpled message Damien had discarded onto the table. This challenge is simply a formality, a way of framing the coming conflict as though we forced his hand, rather than admitting he intended violence from the very beginning. Then we do not give him the satisfaction of a formal answer at all, Damien said. We prepare our defenses, and when he arrives expecting either surrender or panic, he finds neither. Alina stepped forward then, drawing several surprised glances from the advisors gathered around the table. I want to be part of the front line when this happens, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I understand if that decision is not mine to make within your territory, Damien, but I have spent 5 years running from this man, and I refuse to hide behind these walls now while others risk their lives for a danger that began because of choices I made. Absolutely not, Damien said immediately, his tone sharp enough that several guards nearby exchanged uncertain glances. You are not trained for open combat, Alina. Nathaniel wants you specifically. Placing yourself directly in his path is not courage. It is recklessness that could cost you your life for no meaningful gain. Then let me help in whatever way I can that does not require combat training, Alina pressed, unwilling to simply retreat into the safety he clearly wanted to force upon her. I know Nathaniel's mannerisms. I know how he thinks, how he manipulates fear to control the people around him. If there is any moment during this confrontation where that knowledge could be useful, I want to be close enough to offer it, not sitting safely behind these walls while others face danger I helped create. Damien studied her for a long moment, something conflicted moving behind his controlled expression, before he finally exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. You will remain within the castle walls during any direct fighting, he said finally, his voice firm but no longer carrying the sharp edge it had a moment before. But I will have you positioned within the command post, where your knowledge of Nathaniel can be used immediately if needed. That is the compromise I am willing to make, Alina, nothing further. It was more than she had expected, and Alina nodded, grateful for even this small measure of trust extended toward her judgment. Thank you, she said quietly. The following days passed in a blur of preparation, guards drilling in the courtyards, scouts moving constantly between the castle and the eastern border, reporting back with updates on Nathaniel's approaching forces. Alina spent much of that time beside Henry and the other advisors, offering whatever insight she could into Nathaniel's likely strategies, while Damien moved constantly between different sections of his territory, personally overseeing preparations at every checkpoint and gate. It was during one of the rare quiet moments in those hectic days, late in the evening, as most of the castle had finally settled into uneasy sleep, before the confrontation everyone knew was coming, that Alina found Damien alone on a balcony overlooking the eastern fields, staring out toward the darkness where Nathaniel's forces were reportedly gathering. She almost turned back without disturbing him, but something in the tense set of his shoulders made her step forward instead, coming to stand quietly beside him at the balcony railing. You should be resting, Damien said without turning to look at her, though his voice carried none of the cold formality he had maintained throughout most of her return. I could say the same to you, Alina replied gently. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the fields. I keep thinking about what you said, he finally admitted, his voice low, almost hesitant, in a way Alina had never heard from him before, about choosing to stand and fight rather than running. I spent 5 years believing you chose to run from everything we had, believing that whatever I felt for you had simply never been real for you at all. And now I find myself preparing to fight a war that exists entirely because you chose, at enormous personal cost, to protect people you loved rather than protect yourself. I am sorry, Damien, Alina said softly. I am sorry for every single day of silence, for every moment you spent believing I never cared. I have wanted to explain myself to you every single day for 5 years, and I never found a way to do it safely, not until my sister's danger left me no other choice but to finally return and risk whatever consequences waited for me here. Damien finally turned to look at her, his expression open in a way it had not been since her return, something vulnerable and uncertain visible beneath the careful control he usually maintained. "I do not know how to simply forget 5 years of believing you betrayed me without reason," he said quietly. "But I also cannot ignore what I have watched over these past weeks, the courage it took to return here at all, the way you have thrown yourself into helping protect this territory despite having every reason to simply hide and protect only yourself. I do not know what that means yet, for either of us. But I no longer believe the woman standing in front of me is someone who ever stopped caring what happened to me, even during the 5 years I believed otherwise." Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes, 5 years of grief and fear, and hope finally converging in a single suspended moment on a quiet balcony overlooking fields that would, within days, become a battlefield. "That means more to me than I can properly express," she said. Damien reached out hesitantly and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his touch light and careful, as though he were still uncertain whether he had any right to offer such tenderness after everything that had passed between them. "Whatever happens in the coming days," he said quietly, "I am glad you came back, Alina. Regardless of everything else that remains unresolved between us, I am glad you did not let fear keep you away forever." They stood together in silence after that, side by side at the balcony railing, watching the darkness where danger waited to arrive. And for the first time since she had fled her own wedding 5 years before, Alina allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, whatever battle awaited them at dawn, she would not face it alone, and neither, perhaps, would the fragile hope now growing quietly between them despite everything that had once threatened to destroy it completely. Dawn arrived gray and heavy with mist, and with it came the first horn sounding from the eastern watchtowers, warning that Nathaniel's forces had finally been sighted moving across the border fields. Alina stood in the command post exactly as promised, a fortified section of the castle's outer wall from which Henry and several senior advisors coordinated the defense, watching through narrow windows as the distant tree line began releasing shapes into the mist, 200 strong, exactly as the scouts had reported. Damien stood at the front of his own forces below, his figure unmistakable even at a distance, and Alina's heart clenched painfully at the sight of him, preparing to lead his people directly into danger that existed, at its root, because of choices made years before she had even understood the true scope of what protecting her family would eventually cost. The battle that followed unfolded in pieces, reported to the command post through a constant stream of runners carrying updates from the front lines. Nathaniel's forces struck first at the eastern checkpoint, exactly as predicted, but found the defenses there far stronger than anticipated, Damien's guards holding the line with a discipline that clearly caught the attacking force off guard. Alina watched the reports arrive with growing tension, her knowledge of Nathaniel proving useful almost immediately when the second wave of attacks shifted unexpectedly toward the southern border, instead of continuing pressure on the east. "He is testing for weakness," she said to Henry, studying the map spread across the command table as new reports came in. "This is exactly how he approached me 5 years ago, probing quietly before committing fully to whatever direction promises the least resistance. He will not commit his full force until he believes he has found the softest point in your defenses." Henry relayed her assessment immediately to the runners waiting to carry messages back to the front lines, and within the hour, reinforcements had been shifted to bolster the southern checkpoint before Nathaniel's forces could fully commit to an assault there. The attacking force, finding resistance far stronger than their scouting had suggested, began showing the first signs of hesitation, smaller skirmishes breaking out along the border without the decisive breakthrough Nathaniel had clearly been counting on. It was nearing midday when the situation shifted in a way none of them had fully anticipated. A runner arrived at the command post breathless and pale, reporting that Nathaniel himself had been sighted moving with a small, heavily armed group toward a lesser-used gate along the western wall, far from the main fighting, clearly attempting to slip directly into the castle grounds, while the bulk of Damien's forces remained occupied defending the eastern and southern borders. "He is coming for me directly," Alina said, understanding immediately what the movement meant. "He does not care about winning this battle in the open field. He wants to remove the reason the alliance became possible again in the first place." Henry's expression tightened with alarm. "We need to alert Damien immediately," he said, already turning to dispatch another runner. "There is no time," Alina said, her mind racing as she studied the map, calculating how quickly Nathaniel's smaller group could reach the western gate compared to how long it would take word to reach Damien, and for him to redirect forces back toward the castle itself. By the time Damien receives word and repositions, Nathaniel could already be inside these walls. "What do you propose?" Henry asked, his voice tight with the same urgent calculation Alina felt pressing against her chest. "I know this castle," Alina said. "I spent months here 5 years ago, learning every hallway during preparations for a wedding that never happened. If Nathaniel intends to reach me, I can position myself somewhere that gives our remaining guards the advantage, rather than waiting here while he simply forces his way toward wherever he believes I am hiding." "You want to use yourself as bait," Henry said, understanding immediately and clearly unhappy with the implication. "I want to end this," Alina said firmly. 5 years of running never solved anything, Henry. If Nathaniel believes cornering me here will finally give him what he wants, then let him believe it. Right up until the moment your remaining guards close in around him instead." Henry hesitated only a moment longer before nodding sharply, already calling for the small contingent of guards still stationed within the castle itself to gather and prepare. Alina moved quickly through familiar hallways, her heart pounding, memory guiding her toward the old servant's passage near the western gate, a narrow space she had once explored out of simple curiosity in the weeks before her wedding, never imagining she would one day use that same knowledge to help set a trap for the man who had destroyed her life. She positioned herself in the open courtyard just beyond the western gate, visible enough to be noticed the moment Nathaniel's group breached the entrance, while Damien's remaining guards concealed themselves carefully along the surrounding walls and archways, ready to close in the moment the trap was sprung. She did not have to wait long. The western gate shuddered under a heavy blow, wood splintering, and within moments Nathaniel himself strode through the wreckage, flanked by 6 armed men, his pale gray eyes finding Alina immediately across the courtyard with an expression of cold satisfaction. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying the same unhurried confidence she remembered from 5 years before, as though he had simply been delayed rather than genuinely challenged by everything standing between them. "I confess, I did not expect you to make this quite so easy, Alina. Standing here waiting for me, as though you had simply grown tired of running." "I am done running," Alina said, holding her ground despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. "I spent 5 years hiding from you, Nathaniel, and it protected no one. My mother died anyway. My sister suffered anyway. Whatever you intended to accomplish by threatening my family, it has already cost me everything you thought I still had left to lose." Nathaniel's expression flickered with something that might have been irritation at her defiance, though he quickly smoothed it back into cold amusement. "Then perhaps it is time we finally settle this properly," he said, gesturing for his men to advance. The moment his men moved forward, Damien's concealed guards emerged from the surrounding archways, closing the gap with a speed and coordination that clearly caught Nathaniel's group entirely off guard. Alina stepped backward as the courtyard erupted into sudden controlled chaos, careful to stay clear of the fighting, while ensuring Nathaniel himself remained unable to simply retreat back through the shattered gate the way he had come. The confrontation was brief but fierce, Damien's trained guards quickly overwhelming Nathaniel's smaller escort, until only Nathaniel himself remained standing, surrounded on all sides, his earlier confidence finally cracking into something closer to genuine alarm. "This is not over," he snarled, though the words carried far less certainty than they might have moments before. "You believe capturing me here ends anything. There are others who share my goals, Alina. Removing me changes nothing about the larger ambitions this was always meant to serve." "Perhaps," Alina said steadily, stepping closer despite the guards' watchful positions around them both. "But it ends your ability to threaten my family ever again. And it proves, finally, that hiding never had to be the only answer, not for me, and not for anyone else you have manipulated through fear over the years." It was at that moment that Damien himself arrived, having received word of the breach, and abandoned the front lines the instant he understood what was happening, his expression carrying a controlled fury that promised Nathaniel very little mercy in the reckoning that would follow. He crossed the courtyard in swift strides, coming to stand beside Alina, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a silent, solid presence that steadied her more than she had expected. "You will answer for everything you have done," Damien said to Nathaniel, his voice low and dangerous. "To Alina's family, to the stability of this entire region, to every person who has suffered because of ambitions you were never entitled to pursue through fear and manipulation." Nathaniel said nothing further, his composure finally, completely broken as Damien's guards moved to restrain him fully, leading him away toward whatever judgment awaited within the castle's walls. Alina watched him go, 5 years of fear finally, truly beginning to lift from her shoulders as the man who had haunted every corner of her existence was led away in defeat. She turned to find Damien watching her, something warm and unguarded finally, fully visible in his dark eyes. And for the first time since she had fled that altar 5 years before, Alina felt something close to hope settle steadily into her chest, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but real and solid, and finally, possibly, within reach. The days following Nathaniel's capture brought a flood of changes that Alina could hardly process fast enough. With Nathaniel in custody and his network of manipulated allies quickly unraveling once word spread that their leader had been defeated, the remaining forces along the eastern and southern borders withdrew without further conflict, several of the smaller territories that had aligned with him sending messengers within days to distance themselves entirely from his ambitions and offer apologies for their involvement. Henry oversaw the formal questioning of Nathaniel personally, and what emerged over the following weeks confirmed everything Alina had come to understand about the true scope of what her wedding day had actually threatened to disrupt 5 years earlier. Nathaniel had indeed been acting on behalf of ambitions far larger than simple personal grievance, quietly manipulating the balance of power across the region for years, using fear and threats against innocent families as his primary tool whenever open conflict seemed too risky. Charlotte, finally freed from years of quiet fear that had shadowed her family since Alina's disappearance, began slowly rebuilding a life within Damien's territory, finding purpose helping in the castle's growing efforts to identify and support other families who had suffered under similar manipulation during Nathaniel's years of quiet influence. Watching her sister heal, watching color and laughter slowly return to a face that had grown thin and frightened in the months before her arrival, brought Alina a peace she had not allowed herself to imagine possible during her long years of hiding. But it was the slow, careful rebuilding between herself and Damien that occupied most of Alina's thoughts in the weeks that followed the confrontation at the western gate. He no longer maintained the cold distance that had defined their earliest interactions after her return, but neither did he rush toward the easy warmth they had once shared before everything shattered apart 5 years before. Instead, something new grew steadily between them, built not on the swift certainty of their earlier courtship, but on the slower, more deliberate foundation of trust, rebuilt through action rather than simply through words. He began seeking her counsel regularly on matters concerning the territory's ongoing recovery, valuing her insight in ways that made clear he no longer saw her simply as the woman who had once humiliated him, but as someone whose judgment and courage he had come to genuinely respect through everything they had faced together. They spent quiet evenings together in the castle gardens, conversations flowing more easily with each passing week, old comforts slowly resurfacing beneath careful new boundaries neither of them rushed to cross too quickly. It was nearly 2 months after Nathaniel's capture, on an evening when the last traces of autumn had finally given way to the first cold breath of winter, that Damien found Alina alone in the same garden where Charlotte had once told her sister that hope was not impossible, only patient. "I have been thinking about that day, 5 years ago," Damien said, settling onto the bench beside her, his presence no longer carrying the careful distance it once had. "About everything you gave up to protect the people you loved, and everything it cost you in the years that followed." "I have thought about it every single day since," Alina said honestly. "I do not regret protecting my family, Damien, but I will always regret the pain it caused you, the way it must have felt standing in front of your entire court, believing the person you trusted most had simply abandoned you without cause." "I understand now that you never truly abandoned me at all," Damien said quietly. "You made an impossible choice under threat of losing everyone you loved, and you carried that burden alone for 5 years rather than risk anyone else's safety by seeking help sooner. That is not betrayal, Alina. That is a kind of courage I did not fully understand until I watched you return here, knowing full well the risk it carried, simply because your sister needed you more than your own safety mattered." Alina felt tears gathering, familiar now after months of slowly healing wounds she had once believed would never close. "What are you saying, Damien?" she asked softly, almost afraid to hope too fully for the answer she wanted. "I am saying," Damien said, reaching over to gently take her hand in his, the same careful, deliberate gesture he had offered on the balcony before the battle, "that 5 years apart taught me something I did not expect to learn. I believed, for a long time, that losing you at that altar was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. But watching you return, watching you fight for your family, for this territory, for a second chance neither of us was certain we deserved, I have come to understand that what we lost was never truly gone. It was simply waiting, buried beneath fear and misunderstanding, for both of us to find our way back to it." Alina could not speak for a long moment, the weight of 5 years finally, fully lifting from her chest as she looked into eyes that no longer held cold formality, but the same warmth she remembered from the earliest days of their courtship, deepened now by everything they had both survived to reach this moment. "I never stopped loving you," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Not for a single day, not even during the worst of the fear and the running and the grief. I love you, Damien. I have loved you since long before that altar, and I have continued loving you through every mile I ran trying to protect the family that threat endangered." Damien reached into his coat and withdrew something small, a simple silver ring, far less elaborate than the diamond she had once worn and abandoned 5 years before, but somehow more meaningful for its simplicity, a symbol not of the political alliance their first engagement had represented, but of something rebuilt entirely on honesty and hard-won trust. "I am not asking you to stand before the entire court again, not yet," he said softly. "I am simply asking whether you would be willing to let us try again, properly this time, without threats hanging over either of our heads, without secrets or fear standing between us. Whatever comes next, Alina, I want to build it with you if you will have me." "Yes," Alina said, the single word carrying 5 years of longing and grief and hope finally converging into simple, complete certainty. "Yes, Damien, I would want nothing more." He slid the ring onto her finger, and this time, when he leaned down to press his forehead gently against hers, there was no cathedral full of watching guests, no political alliance hanging over their shared future, only two people who had survived betrayal and fear, and 5 long years of separation to find their way back to each other, stronger and more honest for everything that had once threatened to tear them permanently apart. Word spread quickly through the territory in the days that followed, and when Damien and Alina finally did stand together before the full court months later, it was not beneath an arch of white flowers in a rush toward vows neither of them had time to fully understand, but in a quiet ceremony surrounded by people who had watched Alina's courage over the preceding months and had come, slowly but genuinely, to welcome her back not as the woman who once fled an altar, but as the woman who had returned to fight for everything and everyone she loved, and had ultimately won back a future she had once believed was lost to her forever. Charlotte stood in the front row this time as well, older now, steadier, watching her sister finally receive the happiness that 5 years of running and fear had once threatened to steal away entirely. And when Alina finally spoke her vows, standing beside the man she had once left waiting at an altar in front of his entire court, her voice did not waver, did not falter, carrying instead the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had faced the very worst life could offer, and had emerged, finally, on the other side of it, ready to build a future no threat or fear would ever again have the power to take from her.